morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege to be with so many people involved who represent the backbone of India's manufacturing, logistics, infrastructure, and supply chain ecosystem. When I was invited to speak on this theme, I began thinking about what those words really mean. We use the term supply chain almost every day. It has become part of our business vocabulary. We discuss digital supply chains, intelligent supply chains, AI-enabled supply chains, and resilient supply chains. Yet I sometimes wonder whether we truly appreciate what a supply chain truly represents. So let me begin with a very simple question. What happens when an online order that you placed yesterday, which was to come today, comes tomorrow? Most of us will be grossly disappointed. We may even post an unhappy review, but then life goes on. Most of us don't realize one important question. What happens if the aviation fuel does not reach our airports on time? What happens if the LPG cylinder stops reaching your household for the next 3 days? And what happens if diesel is unavailable for the ambulances, hospitals, telecom towers, food transport, and agriculture operations during the harvesting season? Suddenly, we are no longer talking about customer convenience. We are talking about the functioning of society itself. That, to me, is the difference between an ordinary supply chain and a critical supply chain. Some supply chains deliver products, others sustain life. The greatest compliment a supply chain can receive is that nobody notices it. That is because successful supply chains are invisible. We notice electricity only when there is a power outage. We notice about water supply when the taps run dry. And we notice fuel only when the petrol pumps run dry. And we notice supply chains only when they fail. That invisibility is not an accident. It is the outcome of thousands of decisions made every single day by people who most of us will never know. A customer drives into a petrol pump, a retail outlet, fills the fuel in 2 minutes, pays the bill and drives away. For the customer, the transaction is over. But for those of us working behind the scenes, those 2 minutes represent the successful completion of a journey that may have started several weeks earlier and several thousand kilometers away. Every liter of fuel tells a story. It's a story of engineering, planning, and logistics. But above all, it's a story of trust. Because every time a customer drives into a fuel station, he assumes the fuel will be available. That confidence is built over years. It cannot be purchased. It has to be earned every single day. People often ask me, what was the most important lesson during my years in leading India's largest energy enterprise? Many expect the answer to be technology. Others expect me to talk of digitalization, automation, or AI. These technologies are undoubtedly transforming our industry, and I will come to them shortly. But if I had to summarize nearly 4 decades of experience in one sentence, it would be this: a supply chain is ultimately a human system supported by a technology, not a technological system supported by people. Technology enables visibility, speed, analytical ability, but technology does not exercise judgment, inspire confidence. Ultimately, decisions are made by people and its leadership that determine whether an organization remains steady when the circumstances become uncertain. I was reminded of this eternal truth during the COVID-19 pandemic. Like every one of you, we found ourselves facing a situation that none of us had experienced before. Cities came to a standstill almost overnight. Movement restrictions changed rapidly. Traditional forecasting methods, models were totally outdated, and everything became unreliable because past data could not predict the future demand. Yet one thing remained absolutely unchanged. India still needed energy. Hospitals continued to require uninterrupted fuel supplies. Ambulances had to be kept moving. Millions of households still required LPG for cooking. Essential goods still had to be transported. The nation's economic activity may have slowed down, but essential services could not stop. I remember thinking at that time that continuity had ceased to be merely a business objective. It had become a national responsibility. Looking back today, I believe COVID taught us lessons that no management textbook could have explained so vividly. Resilience is not something you build during a crisis. A crisis merely reveals whether you are built for resilience beforehand or not. The systems you have invested for so many years, the relationships that you have nurtured with suppliers, transporters, and partners, the trust that you have built within your own organization, the culture that you have created. These are the foundations upon which continuity rests when disruption arrives. Crises do not create organizational character, they only reveal it. As I look around this hall today, I see people as diverse in the manufacturing, healthcare, aviation, retail, infrastructure, and logistics. Your products are different, your customers are different, your business models are different. Yet, I suspect, over the past few years, all of us have reached the same conclusion. The world has become extraordinarily efficient, but it has also become extraordinarily fragile. And now, fragility has demonstrated more dramatically than in one narrow stretch of water that has dominated international headlines in recent weeks, the Strait of Hormuz. Until recently, many people outside the energy industry rarely thought about it. Today, almost everyone recognizes its importance. To me, however, the Strait of Hormuz is far more than a geopolitical flashpoint. It is perhaps the world's most fascinating logistics classroom, and it teaches important lessons that extend well beyond the petroleum industry. In fact, I would argue that every supply chain, whether in pharmaceuticals, automobiles, electronics, or consumer goods, has something important to learn from it. Let me explain why. The Strait of Hormuz has occupied headlines repeatedly. For many people, it is just a geopolitical crisis in troubled waters. For me, it is something else. It is perhaps something that we all need to learn and understand. So the Strait of Hormuz is not just a narrow stretch of water stretching between Iran and Oman. It is one of the most important maritime arteries of the global economy. Every day, millions of barrels of crude oil, petroleum products, LPG pass through it. This narrow passage before reaching the consumers in Asia, Europe, and beyond. And now think about this extraordinary nature of this reality. A disruption occurring thousands of kilometers away from India has the potential to influence airline ticket prices in Mumbai, fertilizer costs in Punjab, freight rates in Chennai, and manufacturing costs in Gujarat. Few events illustrate the interconnectedness of modern supply chain more vividly than this. While the world now understands focused on the geopolitical development, I found myself thinking quite differently. I asked myself, what is Hormuz really teaching us? And the answer, I believe, extends far beyond the petroleum industry. The first lesson is, every supply chain has an Hormuz. It may not be a maritime passage. It may be a single supplier on whom you have become excessively dependent upon. It may be one critical raw material that it sourced from only one geography. It may be a specialized software platform on which your operations without which the operations cannot function. It may be a particular port, a transportation corridor, or a data center, or even one highly specialized manufacturing facility. So every organization has one dependency that appears perfectly manageable until one day it isn't. That is why one of the most important questions everyone should ask here is, what is bigger, cost or what is our Hormuz? Everybody should understand what is their Hormuz. Because once you identify your Hormuz, you begin to think differently about resilience. For many years, businesses around the world pursued efficiency with remarkable success. We reduced inventories, standardized suppliers, just-in-time supplies, optimized transportation. We squeezed costs from every part of the value chain. Those strategies helped industries become globally competitive. There is absolutely nothing wrong with efficiency. In fact, efficiency must remain essential. But the events of the last few years, from COVID to the semiconductor shortage, from the Red Sea disruptions and the tensions around the Hormuz, have reminded us that efficiency alone is not any longer sufficient. An efficient supply chain is not necessarily a resilient supply chain. The cheapest supplier is not always the safest supplier. The shortest route is not always the most dependable route. The lowest inventory is not always the wisest inventory. The challenges before today's leaders, therefore, is not to choose between efficiency and resilience. It is to achieve both of them. This has required a subtle but an important change in the mindset. For decades, we have asked how to reduce costs. Today, we must ask how to preserve continuity. Those are not competing objectives, they are complementary objectives. Because a highly efficient supply chain that collapses during disruption ultimately becomes the most expensive supply chain of all. The second lesson from Hormuz is equally important. Resilience cannot be created after the disruption happens. When uncertainty suddenly appears, organizations often rush to identify alternate suppliers, diversify logistic routes, or increase inventories. But by then, valuable time has already been lost. True resilience is built quietly, patiently, and often invisibly during the period of stability. It is rather like maintaining a fire station. Most people wonder why so many resources are lying idle. But on the day the fire breaks out, nobody asks that question. They are simply grateful that the capability exists. The same principle applies to supply chain. Alternative sourcing arrangements, multiple transportation options, strategic inventories, and flexible manufacturing. Business continuity planning. All these appear expensive when nothing goes wrong. They become priceless when something does. This brings me to another aspect of resilience that is very close to my professional experience. For many years, whenever India is discussed in energy security, the conversation naturally revolves around the strategic petroleum reserves. They remain extremely important and continue to be essential components of national preparedness. However, over the years, I've increasingly come to believe there is another dimension that requires equal attention, and that is flexibility. For our oil industry, what is meant by refinery flexibility? Simply put, it is the capability of a refinery to process different type of crude oil sourced from different parts of the world without compromising operational efficiency. At first glance, it appears to be an engineering issue. It is much more than that. It is a strategic capability. Because during periods of geopolitical uncertainty, countries that possess flexibility have greater freedom to adapt to changing supply patterns. They are less vulnerable to disruptions affecting a single source of crude. In other words, resilience is not merely storing of more crude oil, it is basically how many types of crude oil can you really process. Every manufacturing organization should ask this question: how flexible are we? Can we work with alternate suppliers? Can we adopt our processes if one raw material is unlikely to be available? Can we continue operations if transport corridors are disrupted? Flexibility, therefore, is not an engineering characteristic. It is a leadership choice. This is one final lesson from Hormuz that I consider perhaps the most profound. Modern supply chains are no longer purely commercial systems. They have become instruments of national resilience. When fuel reaches hospitals, when medicine reaches pharmacists, when food reaches market, when electricity reaches homes, supply chains are no longer supporting business. They are sustaining society. They are changing the responsibility of each and every one of us. We are not just moving products, we are enabling lives. And when viewed through that lens, resilience ceases to be a management concept. It becomes a national obligation. This, I believe, is the real lesson of Hormuz. It reminds us that supply chains are not judged by how effectively and efficiently they are performed. They are judged by how reliable they continue to function when the world becomes uncertain. And that naturally leads to the next question. If resilience has become the defining challenge of our times, what kind of leadership it demands? That is what I would like to leave with you in my final part of my message. In the recent events, it is this uncertainty we have realized is not an occasional visitor. Uncertainty has become a permanent feature of the business landscape. For a long time, businesses could plan on the assumption that tomorrow would look broadly similar to today or yesterday. Supply chains were designed for stability. Forecasts were built on historical trends. Risks were generally localized, and disruptions were relatively infrequent. The world has changed. The world has become deeply interconnected. This is one of our greatest strengths, but it is also one of the greatest vulnerabilities. In such an environment, leadership assumes a totally different meaning. Leadership is no longer about ensuring that everything goes according to a plan. Leadership is about ensuring that the organization continues to perform when the plan no longer works. That distinction is important. Anyone can manage operations when the environment is predictable. A true test of leadership comes when certainty disappears. It is those moments that people look towards the leader, not necessarily for perfect answers, but for confidence, clarity, and direction. Looking back over my own professional journey, I've often reflected on what distinguishes organizations that emerge stronger from crisis than those that struggle. It is rarely superior technology, rarely large financial resources. More often than not, it is the culture of the organization that has been built over the years. Culture determines how quickly information travels, whether people escalate problems or hide them, whether teams work together or retreat into functional silos, whether people merely perform what assigned tasks or willingness to go beyond when circumstances demand. During the COVID period, I witnessed countless examples of this. There were employees who traveled under great difficult circumstances, simply because they understood that someone somewhere was depending upon them. There were operators who continued working in refineries despite enormous uncertainties. There were drivers, maintenance personnel, engineers, and field staff who quietly performed their duties without expecting a recognition. When history records those difficult months, it will rightly acknowledge the doctors, nurses, police personnel, and the other frontline workers. But I also believe that the thousands of men and women working across India's supply chain who ensured essential commodities continue to reach the people who needed them. They reminded us behind every resilient supply chain lies an equally resilient human being. This is a lesson I will never forget. AI and digital technologies will undoubtedly transform forecasting, planning, and execution. We should embrace them enthusiastically, but technology cannot support decision. It cannot replace leadership. That responsibility will always remain with leadership. I therefore believe that the future belongs not only to the organizations that simply deploy the best technology, but to organizations that successfully combine technological excellence with human judgment. That combination will distinguish resilient enterprises from merely efficient ones. There is another change taking place that deserves our attention. Increasingly, governments around the world are beginning to recognize that certain supply chains are too important to be viewed merely through a commercial lens. They are energy, food, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, semiconductors, and telecommunications. These are no longer just industries. They are the strategic capabilities of the country. As a result, the role of supply chain is also changing. We are no longer merely custodians of cost. we are custodians of continuity. This is a far greater responsibility. It requires us to think beyond the quarterly performance. It requires us to think about resilience, sustainability, and national capability. It requires us to ask not only how efficient we can operate today, but how effectively we can withstand tomorrow's uncertainties. So allow me to leave you with one final thought. For decades, business measured the supply chains by three parameters: cost, speed, and efficiency. Those metrics are important and they always will be. But I believe that the coming decade will also add a fourth parameter, that is trust. Ultimately, resilience depends on trust. Trust among customers, among governments, employees, and partners. Without trust, no supply chain remains resilient for long. And also, let me conclude where I began. When we think of supply chains, we often think of trucks, ships, warehouses, inventories, and technology. But after spending 4 decades in the world's one of the largest enterprise I've led, I've come to believe that these are only the visible elements. The real foundation of resilient supply chains are far less visible. They are leadership, foresight, relationships, and flexibility. And above all, there are people. The best supply chains are not that never encounter disruption. Such supply chains do not exist. The best supply chains are those that continue to serve society despite the disruption. In other words, they continue to keep the nation growing. If there is one message I would like all of us to take back from this conclave, it is this: the question before supply chain leaders is no longer how to build the efficient supply chain. The question is how to build a supply chain that the nation can depend when it matters the most. Because when supply chains cannot fail, resilience is not merely a strategy, it becomes a responsibility. And leadership is not merely about managing operations, it is about safeguarding continuity. And one phrase that I want all of you to carry home is that, what is your Hormuz in your supply chain? Thank you very much.